Up next, we have Golda Velez. Golda Velez is a senior software engineer in Risk. I love her title, senior software engineer in Risk, Caltech graduate, and human rights advocate. And I know she's so much more than that, what she has, briefly mentioned here. I'll invite her to stay.
Hi, Shilpi.
Hi, Gulda. How are you? I love your very brief introduction. I know you are so experienced and you've done so much work, and you are a leader in your own way in technology. And you have some very interesting talk today that you are going to share with us. So I'm really excited.
Thank you, Shilpi. I hope so. It's going to be more bottom up. It's not going to be rigorous scientific because I didn't have time to do a scientific experiment based on the proposals I have. But yeah, let's jump into it. I will share my screen.
Sure.
And let's see if that works. Okay. If I have to run to my second monitor, I will do that. Now I have the single monitor.
I can see it. Yeah, here.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to go ahead and present this. And can you see all right?
Yes, we can. I'm going to go backstage, Golda. All the best.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie. All right. So I want you guys who are listening to be ready to take a little bit of a different mindset. I'm going to shift your framework just a little bit, because a lot of times when we're talking about ethics and AI, we're really thinking of ourselves. And most of us who are high-end executives or software engineers in US and European countries, we have a certain life that we live and certain pressures that are on us and certain considerations we have. But I want you to think a little bit about being connected in this larger world where actually a very large number of people in the world, that is not their situation. They may have similar skills, but they're actually in a world where they're subject to arbitrary violence. And that's true in many places in the Middle East. It's true in places in China. It's true in places in Russia. It's true in places in Africa, in South America, and in some cases in some of the countries that we think of as the developed world, there's actually some instances of this. But mainly I'm talking about places where everybody knows that you can get hurt if you are caught saying the wrong things. And there's a lot of those places in the world. We are all connected. So the other shift I'm asking you to take is from, oh, I'm reading the news. Oh boy, that happened over there. That has nothing to do with me. Well, it has to do with me. I work at Uber. One of our board members happens to be a fellow who happens to be a Saudi guy who happens to be connected to some people who he could have a very strong influence on some of the things in the Middle East if he wants to. And I am taking that money. So I am connected to that. I think a lot of us are more connected than we like to think about. But how does this relate to AI? And this is why I said sources of truth. So if we want to take AI and try to solve ethical problems, what are the ethical problems we want to solve? How do you make models? How do you make reusable sources of truth to train those models? Because everyone who does AI, you know that the source of truth means that's the thing your model is trying to produce. You have a training set. Where do we get that training set for this kind of serious problem? And just kind of looking at the bigger picture of the problem. What problem am I talking about? I'm talking about the problem that disinformation defends violent acts. I'm going to make the hypothesis, as we're talking about hypotheses, that entities that commit violent acts, not through a justice system, but just arbitrarily, also tend to lie about them. And they tend to smear the victims of those acts. They tend to create a story that defends their acts, which may be provably not true. And they then promote that story on social media, and they have a lot of financial resources to cause that story to be promoted. So that's what I'm talking about combating, is the use of entities that have large amounts of financial resources to defend their violent acts by disinformation campaigns. So I feel that AI can be used for that. Now, sometimes you have, when you think of AI's use in social networking, you might think of things like Facebook, where we're flagging hate speech, where we're flagging those things. And sometimes it's individual hate speech, but often it's actually troll farms and coordinated campaigns. And of course, there's a consideration for free speech. You can't just tell people they can't say mean things because they can say mean things. But you have these kind of things that have happened that were in some cases demonstrably supported by heavily financed disinformation campaigns. And you can measure coordinated inauthentic behavior. That's something that can be analyzed. You have all these different sites. This is a particular one which was in the Middle East. But it's demonstrably a cluster of coordinated posts and releases about a particular subject. So this can be measured and those posts can be taken down. And so a lot of places, Twitter, Facebook, they do have algorithmic methods of finding coordinated inauthentic behavior. But because this is just an algorithm, they tend to be careful when you penalize it. Whenever you're trying to set up a fraud response or a risk response, you have to be careful for false positives. So you have to prioritize what you're going to penalize. You can't just strongly penalize everything that looks like inauthentic behavior, because at some point you're going to catch real users who are just trying to tell their friends things. So you have to kind of be able to prioritize those, and that's what we're going to get into. Also, I want to emphasize that I've spoken to people who work at Twitter and work at Facebook in these areas, and they have told me that without humans, without the human operators finding those sources of truth, they would fall down in a couple days and just be overrun by spam. So we're still really dependent on human judgment for the source of truth for many things. The coordinated campaigns can be detected algorithmically, but we're really dependent on human judgment to create the source of truth for the models to ban the disinformation. Now, those human operators are low-paid people, maybe in the Philippines, who are scanning through all these violent images using some heuristics. And, that's what we have. That's our defense. But there's other things. Okay, so that's what I was also going to talk about here, is that we have all these kind of human operators quickly scanning through. It works pretty well against spam because the incentives to spam are financial. And so you can kind of combat them either in a blockchain kind of way or just pretty simply. But if the incentive for the disinformation is outside the network, and it's not just financial, it's a dictator who's in control of a lot of money, doesn't want to have something exposed that he did, and he's going to use all his resources to prevent it from being exposed. There's kind of overwhelming financial resources being set on the disinformation side of the equation. And then we have, these people trying to find it based on some criteria, and they're scanning through all this violent and, explicit sort of stuff, and they have to be clicking on it all the time. So that's one method that's being used right now. There's something else that's happening that I think is not being tapped into. And what that is that there are already organizations that are what I call high lift. They depend on their credibility. The value of these organizations relies on their credibility. They are very careful before they accept cases. I know this because I've spoken to family members of a guy who was kidnapped, and I asked the Committee to Protect Journalists, will you add him to your cases? And they're like, well, we can't add him unless you translate everything he ever wrote and we make sure he's not a terrorist. So they really spend a very, very high lift before they will assert this guy was kidnapped extrajudicially, and it's an injustice that he was kidnapped by his government. And they really have a high lift before they take on that case. So there's this high effort being done. Bellingcat has these volunteers that are really spending more time than the other human operators being hired by Twitter and Facebook, carefully, logically analyzing photos. Places like the New York Times and Washington Post, these people spend a tremendous amount of effort, and we are not capturing that effort into the sources of truth, except sometimes through the human operators who might look it up on these sites. But isn't there an automated way that we could capture this stream of high lift, high effort, kind of anchored assertions that we could then use to prioritize our models and the actions of our models? So that's really my question. Can we, if we set a clear goal, and our clear goal would we want to reduce disinformation that leads to violence, so we have to have a way of measuring that, or that's associated with violence. And can we use these highly credible sources to maybe increase the penalties So we're not just saying, oh, here's some coordinated actions that happened, but it was all just to sell potato chips. So, I mean, who cares? Here's a coordinated action that happened to smear the wife of a murdered person. And let's prioritize that one. And on that one, let's have a higher penalty that we can do to those devices and those accounts, because they not only undertook a coordinated action, they undertook a harmful coordinated action. And so we are willing to set a lower bar, or a higher bar, as you will, a higher penalty and a lower bar for the penalty, because they were so harmful. We're willing to risk more false positives to eliminate this network that was extremely harmful, as opposed to the one that was trying to sell potato chips, which we might let it sneak through. So how do we do it? I'm an engineer, but I'm not saying this is a finalized thing. I just wanted to put something out there so it could be iterated on. You have to have some kind of machine parsable format. You have to have signing and credibility staking, because you can be guaranteed that the bad actors will attempt to put assertions into your chain of assertions. They will try to influence it. So you have to have credibility staking by whoever is allowed to include reputation assertions, and you have to be able to either have a trust web where we assign credibility for good reasons, have a way for people to lose credibility, because you have to really keep that a clean schema, and it could propagate from those trusted organizations like CPJ, like Bellingcat, that are already doing the high lift. I'm going to say, I trust them and I trust what they say. Maybe we can even pay them for it. And we have to be able to talk about entities. So there's a couple of challenges here. But I think that we could do some of it quite simply. So here's like a simple format. Here's some subject that we're talking about. Here's some assertion. We'll have some qualifiers, and here's who said it. And I would like, in the real world, we recognize the difference between me saying, I saw this with my own eyes. I was there. I saw a policeman grab her by her hair and pull her down. I can say, I spoke to the sister of someone who was kidnapped, and she says he's gone. And she says that she can't reach him. So I spoke to her. I might speak to someone whose name I cannot reveal because they would be in danger, but I can assert, I can stake my credibility that I spoke to them. Sometimes there's been a thorough investigation. Sometimes you read an article and you're simply sourcing from an article, and sometimes it's just your opinion. And I think we need to distinguish between those things and create some kind of UX that allows people to easily make these rich assertions and not just click like, thumbs up, thumbs down. It's kind of like that reporting interface that we get. But I think that these things are so valuable in the real world, and yet we have no UX to capture these richer assertions. It strikes me that there must be some low-hanging fruit left on the table here that, well, I guess it's not on the table if it's hanging, but there's something that we're not using in our models, because this is what happens in the real world. We investigate things. So here's some sample assertions. I pulled this from CPJ, and you might just be using a string. You might, be better if it was an entity, but a string is somewhat useful because the strings are what you're going to find on social media. You're not always going to find social media referring to the entity. They're just going to use the string. So here's like the verb, here's how we know about it, and here's who. And then here's when there's two of them. So CPJ did do an investigation, says he was kidnapped. I also talked to someone who said he was kidnapped, who knew him, who talked to people who do it. So I have secondhand information, and they have. And so you can then roll these up and give different levels of credibility. Now, how does this relate to the automated bot networks? One thing that happens quite frequently is you can use negative sentiment analysis to see when an automated bot network is creating negative sentiment towards someone who was extrajudicially harmed. So there was a smear campaign against Jamal Khashoggi. They said he was a terrorist, and if he was a terrorist, you should bring him to trial, not kill him in some, hidden way. So if there's a smear campaign against someone who was also harmed in an extrajudicial manner, I think that it's legitimate to back propagate and say whoever is coordinating a smear campaign against someone who was imprisoned without a trial, that's a problem. And we should be able to eliminate that without being so afraid of the freedom of speech, because it's associated with harm. It's not just that we're saying, oh, this guy's saying dumb things. It's that we're saying bad things about him, and also we kidnapped him. That's a different thing. So you could use, something like BotSlayer to find the coordinated disinformation, use sentiment analysis, and then associate it with those assertions. So it's a little bit of a heavy lift, but I think it's quite doable. I think it's important enough that it should be done. There would also be other uses of a reputation feed. This is a proposal I made in the Twitter Blue Sky project. It's actually in a different order, so don't get confused. Here, the user ID is first. And these are more granular assertions. Maybe here's a journalist who says, this photo, I took it. Here's some other guy who also says he took that photo. How do we know which one's which? And this guy says that guy did it. But maybe if we trust Bellingcat and Bellingcat says that this photo was a doctored, I'm sorry, he said he took a different photo. Then if we trust Bellingcat, we could propagate the trust and then have low credibility for this guy who's associated with the photo that Bellingcat said was doctored. So these things would be higher lift. I know they may be harder to scale, but I think if we allow a UX with somewhat rich assertions, we'd get a lot of data. Because there are people who have a stake in asserting those things. And for example, the Bellingcat volunteers do a lot of granular assertions all the time, but it just comes out as human readable text. And if we could get that into machine readable assertions, I think that's just a really valuable data source that's being left on the table. And so really what I want to say is that, we may not have the full solution, but we have to be working on the right problem. And I know privacy is important. I know other things are important, but she's dead. He is up for 20 years. He was a Twitter, he had a blog on Twitter with a lot of followers, and they hired someone at Twitter to find his IP address and his location and dragged him away. His name is Abdurrahman Al-Sadan. This is Tawfiq. He spoke up for his friend who had been kidnapped, and the next day he was kidnapped. That was a little over a year ago. He's still gone. He's in Iraq. And actually, this woman, I actually forgot her name, but she's in Russia. She is a journalist who was also killed. So we're not really making a systematic effort to stop this. There's news articles and everybody goes on with their day, but we're not going to a system of experimentation and outcome measurement to stop this from happening. And I think we should. So thank you very much for listening. I would love to take some questions. I have a lot of anecdotal things I could share with you, and I would just love to chat a little bit.
Hi, Golda. Great talk. I know we have some great comments here. So what data, let me show this. What data do you input in your first training model?
Right. So I think that you have to first allow for these granular assertions to be made. And then I think you have to allow entities from trusted, that you have to decide on an initial trust, that you decide maybe and that's a really good question. I see someone saying, how do you measure trust?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you have to initially, have people talk about it. I think that having that initial conversation of who's trusted is an important conversation to have. And I think that there should be consensus that these organizations, which are trusted by our government, by the United States government, they're trusted by the United Nations, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Human Rights Watch. There is some disagreement on that. There is always a political consideration, but I think that there's certainly Snopes. You can name maybe 8 or 10 organizations that are high trust and assign a certain initial trust to those that's high. And then you can include things like Kleros, which has a human jury on is this human? And if you allow a lot of granular assertions, I think that you are going to get things that are provably wrong. A person will assert that they are human when they are not. A person will assert that they are in the United States when they are not in the United States. And some of those things could be tested in a granular way, and you can back propagate the errors. So I don't say that I have the entire model completely sketched out, but I think we need the rich data source, and we need to recognize that there's credibility staking. We can have initial credibility, and there has to be a way to adjust that, and that we need to start those models.
And I also liked your thought on credibility staking from the number of degrees apart, right? If it's the first person who has direct experience versus a third degree apart who's just read it in the news versus a second person, like you got the news from the sister whose brother was kidnapped, right? So I mean, it would be hard to put those kind of, it makes sense. And I can see some challenges in how if we created a public network like that, how we would put weights and parameters on those weights.
You have to separate your concerns. There's the assertions, which is your raw data.
Yeah.
And the raw data is that I say that I heard this secondhand. Someone says there was an investigation. So that's your raw data. And then you can have different models that put different weights and you can start testing them with their outcomes. But you have to have the rich data for them to model on.
Right. And that brings us to the point, if people are honest and when they are saying that this is what I heard from someone. Nowadays, people share information as if they have first-hand information on it, as if they are the authority on it. So it's very hard to understand if this is a hearsay or is this coming firsthand. I want to take.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
You can actually, you could have a view that depends on my point of view. I could say I trust CPJ and anything that they, say I want propagated strongly to me. So I could say in anybody that they trust, I also trust. And you could have a trust web. And so then the people who are kind of trolls are not really going to be connected in that trust web. They're going to be in their own bubble of trolls that trust each other. So I think you can address it.
This might be easier for organizations than for individuals. I feel like organizations over time can be trustworthy and we can give them extra weightage that they are trustworthy. For individuals, it might be a little harder to implement, but certainly something to consider. And there are just so many questions.
That's great.
George has another question. When we talk about long-term democracy, infrastructure, facts, science, evidence, and the dissemination of such must be funded. It cannot be a ragtag group of volunteers. If we aspire towards democracy, we must make long-term infrastructure investments.
Yeah.
That is true.
I would definitely agree with that. I think we're getting somewhere. Oh, did George want to speak? We're getting somewhere with like the DAO model of voting on using funds. I think that's positive. I think that there needs to be a little bit more delegation and a little bit more conversations in the DAO models, but I think that they're a good start to having democratic control over funds that maybe could be directed towards that. I would definitely like to see governmental support of those. You have to be careful with organizations because they can be body snatched. Organizations can live longer than people, but they can be taken over and switched. So you have to make sure that the organizations themselves have an infrastructure that's not easy to simply take over by somebody purchasing the organization or buying a few board seats.
Rakesh here says always showing information lineage might be an easier way to have.
Absolutely. Sometimes it has to stop with a secondhand reporter because I can't say who told me, but I am willing to stake my credibility on it. And if someone proves it's wrong, you should lower my credibility.
Munir says, however, if the information is coming from reliable sources and then corrected based on what we knew then versus what we know now, then they lose credibility.
It depends what they assert. If I'm asserting that somebody was murdered and they are alive, I think I should lose credibility because I was wrong. It depends on what you're asserting. You should be careful to assert only things that you actually know or that you've investigated.
George says, I would use historical models to predict the probability of trusted information, data not perfect, but based upon prior experience with source.
Yeah, and I think that if you use them over time, you'd build up more of that historical data that you could use in a machine parsable way. Initially, you have to use human experience because we don't have it machine parsed.
So I know that, Golda, you said that this is not a fleshed out model. This is something that you are thinking about and doing. And I would love to get you more involved. We have an active community and I know you work with Blue Sky and you work with a lot of other organizations as well. I would love to continue the conversation and see how we can actually build something.
Sure. If there's a team that wants to do it, I'd be happy to advise people, make suggestions and mentor and bring them developers. And I want to just mention really quickly, I have 1 minute left. Making direct contact with people is so valuable. And there are developers in Myanmar, there's developers in Afghanistan that we actually can hire. There's women in Afghanistan who I have about the CVs of about 20 or 30 women in Afghanistan right now who need remote work, who are attorneys and civil rights workers who could maybe do some of this work. And they don't need a lot of money, but they need jobs quite badly. So if there's any funding, if you have $1,000, you can actually hire 10 people and transform the life of 10 women in Afghanistan right now. And I'm in touch with them. We actually have a Slack group. And there's just so much that you can do when you get in direct touch with people. And sure, I would love to participate.
Yes, absolutely. I'll be in touch, Golda. We would love to, Data Ethics for All would love to be a part of something like this. and bring up a project that helps and makes an impact globally. So I'll
Great.
talk to you later. Thank you
Okay,
so
thank
much
you.
for this talk. Very informative. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.